Words we
Good
didn't know a
evening.
year ago. Zoom.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Good evening, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. We'll wait to meet like a critical mass of you in the room. All right. I think that's good. Good evening, everybody. My name is Beth. Welcome to PNP Live. I'm on the events team at Politics and Prose, and we thank you so much for joining us here tonight to celebrate Anne-Marie Slaughter's new book, Renewal, in conversation with Clint Smith. At any time during our event tonight, you can click on the link that I'm going to post in the chat to purchase copies of Renewal from PNP. In addition to growing your own library, a book sale from PNP obviously means that we are able to keep bringing you content like this that we're so proud to bring to our community. You can ask our author a question tonight by submitting it to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Be sure to submit it into the Q&A and not into the chat to make sure that everybody sees it. I want to waste no more time getting to the main event, and I am pleased to now turn it over to Lisa Muscatine, co-owner of PNP, to introduce our speakers.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much, Beth, for taking care of all the administrative details. I really appreciate it. As Beth said, I'm co-owner of Politics and Prose along with my husband, Brad Graham, and we and our entire staff welcome you to tonight's edition of PNP Live. And as Beth said, this is just going to be a wonderful hour that we have ahead of us. It's such a special joy for me to introduce former colleagues and friends, and I guess that makes tonight a super special joy because our guest author this evening, Dr. Anne-Marie Slaughter, is not only a former colleague and friend, but she has written a provocative, elegant gem of a book that I really hope all of you will read if you haven't already. It's called, as Beth said, Renewal, From Crisis to Transformation in Our Lives, Work, and Politics. Anne-Marie, I think it's your 8th book, but it's one of many that she's written in her career. And that career has included tenure in the academy as a professor and as dean of what was formerly known as the Wilson School at Princeton. She's been a top strategist at the State Department. She's a respected public intellectual on matters of foreign policy and more recently on gender, work, and family. She's now CEO of New America and Professor Emerita at Princeton. So how did she begin this examination of renewal, and more specifically of how personal renewal is connected to renewal as a nation? Well, she did it by standing in front of the mirror and taking a good, long, hard look at herself. And as we all can imagine, that is not an easy exercise, but it allowed her to excavate from her own history a better understanding of her limitations and lapses, of painful episodes she has now faced head on, and also with a greater understanding of her successes and achievements. And with those lessons, and also using her really extensive reading of history, literature, poetry, political science, sociology, psychology, anthropology, economics, and I'm sure I'm missing one, she also took a good, long, hard look at our nation. And she urges a braver, more forthright accounting of our history, the only way, she says, that we can truly achieve a collective renewal, which obviously we are deeply in need of. And she offers suggestions of how we can rewrite our narrative to be more expansive and inclusive. So if you think that sounds like a wide-ranging book, you're right, it is. And that is no surprise to those of us who know Anne-Marie. I had the great privilege of working for her when she was director of policy planning at the State Department in the Obama administration. As many of you may remember, Hillary Clinton appointed Anne-Marie to be the first woman ever to hold that position. And it's a very influential one at the state, sort of like heading the Secretary of State's think tank, I guess you might say. And Hillary was really proud that a woman would finally lead that office. And anybody who's ever been in that office up on the 7th floor, right near Mahogany Row, where the secretary's office is, knows that there's a hallway that runs through it with picture after picture after picture of the directors of policy planning over history. And there they all are, one race and one gender, until you get to Anne-Marie. And there was Anne-Marie, and it made all of us so proud. But the real reason that or certainly one of the main reasons that Anne-Marie was hired by Hillary Clinton was because Anne-Marie was someone who could think outside the box, beyond stale doctrines and orthodoxies. She was somebody who could offer imaginative and innovative, creative ideas that could shape 21st century foreign policy. And I just mention all of that because I think courage and creativity have been hallmarks of Anne-Marie's entire career. She calls the book part personal essay, part reflection, part manifesto. It is certainly all of those. It's deeply personal, unvarnished in its candor. And all I kept thinking as I was reading it was, what if all leaders in all realms had this much courage? The courage to open themselves up to critiques of their biases and weaknesses in order to grow and learn and renew. And what if our nation had the courage to reckon honestly with the pain of its past and renew its promise? Well, we are so incredibly lucky that to explore those questions with Anne-Marie tonight is another of our nation's leading public intellectuals, Clint Smith. Clint is a poet, former high school teacher, contributor to the New Yorker, and now is a staff writer at The Atlantic. This year, he has also published a groundbreaking new book, his first work of nonfiction, called How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. It is truly a masterpiece. So I just can't think of two thinkers and two writers better suited to help us consider how America can and should tell the true story of itself and why it hasn't yet than our guests tonight. I hope you all join me in welcoming Anne-Marie Slaughter and Clint Smith to PNP Live.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Anne-Marie, it is so wonderful to be here with you. When I was a New America Fellow, so for those watching, I was a New America Fellow in, I guess it was 2020, or it's a 2020 Fellow. And I would often come into the office and use it as a workspace, and would come to the events and would see the New America staff and would see you and Tyra and others in the hallway. And I've been missing that space and that energy of New America a lot these days. So it's wonderful to be here with you all, even if it's just virtual and we're not passing each other in the lunchroom.
And I can't imagine a better person to have this conversation with. And yes, I wish we were both back at New America, but next best thing.
I appreciate it. So to hop right into it, I mean, your book is titled Renewal, and you spend the beginning of the book kind of examining what renewal is and what it isn't, and doing it on a sort of macro level and a micro level, and thinking about how your understanding of what renewal is and your considerations of what that definition means and doesn't mean has evolved over the years. So maybe to start us off, can you talk about what you mean by renewal and how your understanding of that word or that idea or that framework has shifted and evolved over the past several years?
Absolutely. Although honestly, I think Lissa gave the best description of the book I've ever heard. I'm not sure I could improve on it, but you know, the place to start perhaps is that I love words. And indeed, when I was in law school, I remember one of my professors saying that I really hung on to words as if, you know, they alone could change the world. I don't believe they can change the world, but I do think words matter. And renewal for me is, you know, it's not restoration, it's not reinvention, it's in between. It's a word that looks backwards and forwards at the same time. And that became very important to me over the course of my own journey, but also, you know, thinking about what the nation needs to do. And your own book does the looking backwards so brilliantly. But so you look backwards and you have to reckon and to repair, you have to face yourself honestly. But it's also a word that is about looking forwards and building something new. And it's that tension and the sort of value of both halves of that I think are so important. And I guess both personally and organizationally and nationally, there's a whole industry about reinventing ourselves, you know, a whole new you, particularly in the United States. Europeans don't do this so much, and I don't actually believe you can be a whole new whatever. I think you are obviously shaped by your past, whether you're a person or an organization or a nation. And so it's this ability to transform, because I do think you can change, but starting with what's there that so attracts me about renewal. But I'll just say, and I write about this, it was the staff at New America who pushed me really hard, because I used to just talk about American renewal, and they would say, you know, there's a lot of stuff we don't want to renew. And particularly if you had any experience with urban renewal, that was terrible. And so we now talk about renewing the promise of America. So I think it's important to talk about what exactly you want to renew.
And one of the things that you do similarly at the beginning of the book, where you're making this definition, is you sort of interrogate this idea of we, right? The word we, how you have used we, how collectively we sometimes use we. Could you talk a little bit about that process, and like when, and what was the sort of catalyst to that happening for you, where there was a moment of considering how the language you might be using might be suggesting things or erasing things or making things peripheral that you didn't necessarily, in ways that you didn't necessarily intend for?
I've come to understand that the very ability to use the word we really is a mark of privilege, right? It's this mark of confidence that you speak for some group, and many people, and I've certainly done this in my own writing, you speak for the nation, you know? And I recount in the preface that my sort of awareness of what that word meant and didn't mean was raised after I wrote the article in the Atlantic, Why Women Still Can't Have It All. And I'd never done gender studies or feminism in school. I was a feminist because I grew up in the 70s and 80s. But I would get out there to all these audiences and basically talk about the feminist mystique, the feminine mystique, and the classic second wave feminism as we, you know, we women who were home with our children, and we women who wanted to go into the workplace. And immediately, it won't be a surprise to you, Clint, women of color, and to some extent, women, white women, but who had come from working class backgrounds, were like, that's the story of affluent white women who lived in the suburbs. That is not we. So that really came home to me clearly. And I then read much more about Black feminism and just the whole tensions there of one group speaking for another. And it's hard because we do need to be able to, just even there, we need to be able to evoke a collective. And that is why we is such a powerful word. But I now always, or try, I don't always succeed, I try always to interrogate who is that we that I have in mind. And it is often people like me. That's not we, that's white affluent women, and I get straight women, I can keep qualifying it. And so to be very conscious of who that we is including and excluding, and then some of the time realizing you're not actually speaking, the people you want to be speaking for should be speaking for themselves. So you just don't say anything at all.
And I found that part particularly fascinating because it's something that I've been thinking about over the last few years as well. And I think it's, you know, you're considering it we on a sort of personal level in the ways that you've used it with the intention to, as you said, sort of invoke a collective. And I've been thinking about it too in ways that are tied to a sort of macro societal level set of frames, in the sense that, you know, I wrote a poem about this a few years ago that got a lot of attention, but this idea that people would say we have been through worse before, or like we will make it through, or we'll be fine in the end, or we'll be all right. And I, you know, I am someone who used to say things like that, right? Because the intention is that you want to galvanize, that you want to say, you inspire, that you want to feel optimistic, that you don't want to be sort of wallowing in despair. And so even that is the intention. But what I found myself doing when I said those things was unwittingly not considering the people who don't make it to the other side, who will not be fine in the end. If we think of just COVID, right? Like if we use the COVID, or if we think about the election, the Donald Trump presidency, I mean, I was thinking about it a lot in that moment, because it was like, we'll make it through, this is terrible, but you have to think about all of the people, as you kind of talk about in your book, who are not included in that we. And so much of what your book is about is like the precision of language, and that the intention with which we use certain types of languages, that the intention with which you have used language has not always matched the impact that it has had on people. And you talk about like a moment where you, or a couple of different moments where you like said something that was interpreted in a way that you were not, that you didn't intend necessarily, and that it wasn't your intention. Can you talk a little bit about like, and one of the things you mentioned in that context is this idea of grace and generosity, and how to find, and this is like the omnipresent human question, right? Is like how you find the balance between grace and generosity and accountability and responsibility. How are you sort of thinking about that in your work and in your life?
A lot of important issues there. Let me start with the we, and just say also, now I'm saying we need to face our past with radical honesty and reckon, have a reckoning and reparation, and yet that we, so now I'm talking about a we that has to do something that's really hard, but that we is really white America, and not all parts of white America, but most, no matter how you came through, you are advantaged relative certainly to Black America and other Americans of color. And so I can't either say we, I can say we as a nation as a whole need renewal, but very quickly it breaks down into who needs to do what kind of reckoning. Although I do think that there are few groups among us who don't have things, in their own past. And for instance, talking to Cecilia Munoz, a Latina colleague of mine, she's talking about, well, there's sort of indigenous relatives and Hispanic relatives. And so, but even there, that we is very complicated. And yet, as you say, if you really try to qualify every time you use we with all the things that you do, you're never, first of all, you're not going to get a word out of your mouth because you really need to be thinking about it. But there is a desire to have a verbal, community. I think for me, it's about complexification. I mean, this is Amanda Ripley's work. And on high conflict, and just how critical it is to constantly remember the nuance of, as you say, so COVID wasn't that bad. COVID wasn't that bad for some groups as opposed to other groups, and then bringing their experience in so that you can counter it by still talking about multiples, but recognizing the diversity of their experience and the complexity of their experience. But then fundamentally, and I've been thinking about this a lot, we are a nation. I mean, there is a nation of the United States. I take everybody who is on this soil to be American unless they're declared something else, independent of formal citizenship. And if you're a leader or a thinker and you want change, you revert to the we of inspiration. I do, so I'm much more conscious. I try very hard to qualify. I try to remember the complexity, which is actually just better. It's just richer.
Right.
But to your point about grace, and yeah, I have a 24-year-old son and a 22-year-old son, and I work mostly with millennials and Gen Z. And so there are plenty of things I say that get challenged, believe me. But I do think also, it should be a learning opportunity, for me to say something that inadvertently, denies. I'll just take an example. The point that the indigenous people were on the land, New Jersey, Virginia, wherever, to forget that, or to forget even, showing my pronouns, which I try to do, but don't always do, and don't always use the right pronouns. That's where I draw on the work of Loretta Ross, who says, we need calling in, not calling out. So there again's the we, but it should be a process of mutual education, even when feelings are in play, which is easier said than done, and there are power relationships that make it difficult. But I still think it would be a better presumption, a presumption of grace, at least the first time. It's hard.
Yeah, no, it's difficult. I mean, I think it's a balance. I mean, part of what I've found in my own book and in my process of research is that so many of the tour guides and the docents at these different places had to, in their own work, find this balance between accountability and generosity and great, right? So it's this idea that you can't, if someone shows up to, and this will kind of lead us into our next question, if somebody shows up to Monticello and has no idea about Jefferson, you know, being an enslaver and the fact that he owned hundreds of people and had children with one of his enslaved woman who was his enslaved property, and had, you know, 4 enslaved children that he kept enslaved until they were adults. You can't, from, you know, their general sort of frame is like, you can't blame someone for what they don't know. But once you present that information to them, it is their responsibility to engage directly with it and not run from it, right? And so it's a kind of recognition that because of the systemic and structural failures of so much public education in our country, the failure of our to create any sort of collective public consciousness around our history, that it might not necessarily be, one, it's not effective. It's not effective if you're sort of adversarial with someone when you're actually trying to teach them something. And then also that it's, you know, the idea that it's like their fault that they show up and don't have that information is not, there are multiple factors, as you said, the sort of complexity of factors that shape how any of us, you know, come to understand and know the things that we do and don't know. And you talk about Jefferson in the book, and I think you use him, he's such a, you know, we both used him in our respective books because I think he's such a helpful entry point into thinking about complexity, into thinking about the sort of messiness of the American project. How did you, can you talk a little bit about how, like, what Jefferson means and represents to you in the way that you're thinking about America and the way that you're thinking about so many of the themes that you're thinking through in this book?
I will, and Clint, you know this, but I'll tell everyone who's listening that when you applied for the New America Fellowship, I had already started thinking about this book and sketching things. And I had a little piece on Monticello because I grew up in Charlottesville, as I'll say in a moment. And you had your first chapter of your book, Monticello Plantation. And I read it and was just captivated. I remember sending a note saying, this man has to be a fellow. And it was, so we bonded over Monticello before we knew each other personally. But it is such a perfect microcosm of all the tensions. And I really did. I grew up in Charlottesville. I always say I could have given tours of Monticello because every school trip, every 2 years, off you would go. I remember winning the law prize in 2007. It's like an honorary degree, and actually having dinner in the dining room of Monticello, which is what the Monticello Foundation lets you do that. And there's no electricity, right? I mean, it's and yet, right? And I remember, you know, 1976 and the bicentennial, and it was just all the great Jefferson. There was a little suggestion that maybe he'd had children with Sally Hemings, and people did know her name, but it was well before Annette Gordon Reed's work. And now, of course, yes, it's this constant double-faced narrative, as it should be. But even there, it was funny when I read your book, and you know, you call it Monticello Plantation. It is. It was a plantation. I still wince, right? Because that's just so, I use it now because I recognize it was exactly that double take of, yep, you know, let's call it what it was. It was a plantation. Nobody wants to call it a plantation because that calls attention to the fact that he enslaved lots of people, including his own children, and Sally Hemings herself. And so, I mean, you quote the curator, I guess the former curator, who just says, you know, he created this great university that I got a wonderful, you know, degree at, and he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And I've come to think that it's like double-sided tape. That, you know, and both sides better stick, right? But it's so tempting to go from total veneration, which is what I grew up with, you know, Mr. Jefferson's coming around the corner any moment, to total, like, the man was an unbelievable hypocrite and knew it Right?
Yeah.
It's not, you can't accuse him of just being with the times. He knew full well, that his own hypocrisy, the economics of it, all of that. So I think we have to learn to in another book I wrote about seeing in stereo. And that would apply here, but also as this metaphor of double-sided tape, where you really have to constantly make sure that both narratives are there, and that however awkwardly they stick together.
Yeah, and I think the metaphor of a double-sided tape is really helpful, because a different person might use a metaphor of like two different rolls of tape almost, right? But but they are not. The thing about Jefferson is that it is not that it's like slave owning Jefferson over here and philosopher Jefferson, political president Jefferson over here. It is that the two were deeply entangled in one another. It is that one is only possible because of the other. Who Jefferson is only possible because of the generations of enslaved people who lived on that land, because of the Hemmingses, the Grangers, the Fawcett's, and all of these folks who built that land, who built that home, who cultivated that land, and who, in many ways, I always tell people that land belongs to more than it belongs to Jefferson. I mean, functionally, Jefferson was away for so long in Paris, in New York, in Philadelphia, in DC. And so these are families who lived their entire lives on this plot of land, and whose sense of ownership of that land, I think, to my mind, they have a claim to it as much, if not more so.
And many of them were Jeffersons.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely. I mean, literally part of
yes.
the family. And so I do think that is a helpful frame, because to have double-sided tape is only double-sided tape because you have both sides that are sticky. And to extend this extended metaphor further, are messy and sticky, and very, and like can pick up different things that they don't necessarily. I've probably taken the metaphor too far now. But,
you're the poet. I'm listening.
No, it's a stretch even for me. But I love the metaphor because again, it is like it is one thing, and it is one entangled set of identities and sensibilities, and we can't separate them.
Exactly.
I want to ask a couple questions about the sort of process of writing this book, because one thing that is very evident from reading it is that you read so widely, and you read across so many genres and so many disciplines and so many topics. And I'm curious, like, I'd love to know a little bit about your reading habits, and how, like, when you read, are you taking, like, do you read on a Kindle? Do you like read on paper? Do you audiobook? Are you taking notes? Are you always thinking about how this might inform the book? So part of it is I want to know, like, who are you as a reader? Because the book is full of, you'll quote an economist here, and a historian there, and a poet there, and a philosopher there, and it just is so robust in its citations and the breadth of the citations. So what kind of reader are you? And then also, how did that reading and the extensiveness of that reading shape the way that you wanted to construct the book itself?
No one has ever asked me that. It's a great question. Yeah. So the first thing to say is, it's probably is evident, I'm a voracious reader, right? I often used to say that academics are people who prefer books to people. And I'm not that. I mean, by academic standards, I'm an extrovert, although not by Washington standards, right. But books are my friends. They are, they really are my friends. They're my escape. And, I've just, for instance, discovered Nordic noir, Icelandic murder mysteries. And I must have read 15 of them in the last month. And that's just like candy, right? I can do one a day and I just escape. But they're just this inexhaustible source of interest. And my mother's an artist, my father's a lawyer, and I have elements of both. But creativity for me is the collision of different things. So I do, I'm not systematic. So for this book, once the outlines were there, I deliberately went and sort of went deeper in some places. But overall, I try to read some amount of classics. Really, the courses I wished I'd taken in college, or some I did take but didn't do the reading. Now I'm doing it, and I do that in the morning with my cup of coffee, and then I read at night. I read on planes and trains, but I read on a Kindle. I read on my phone actually, but because I really like being able to highlight. So right now I'm reading The Sum of Us, and the whole thing is practically highlight. But then I can go back. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's fantastic. It's just fantastic. So then I can go back, and I do this often, and just look at my notes. And there were places like I read Gregory Pardlow's Air Traffic, which is just a wonderful book. And I remembered, kind of dimly, he had written something about holidays, and then I can go back and find it. So e-reading has been a great help to me, because otherwise I would have to take careful note cards and remember where they are. And I am not a systematic researcher. And as a writer, this book was by invitation. I mean, Princeton University Press, the Public Square, contacted me in 2019 and said they had some idea of a book I was going to write. And I didn't want to write that book, but I said, I want to write a book on renewal. I've been thinking about this now for a year more, and I want to write something that's short. It's only 50,000 words, and it's hard. And then I want to write something that is more like fiction, right? There are no subheads in the book. They're just these different fragments or vignettes. And I wanted to kind of experiment. Some of my favorite novelists, experiment with those forms. So I wanted to experiment with a nonfiction form, but I also wanted to see if I could braid this the personal and larger. And for that, there is no playbook of what you should research. It's what's in your mind, but I do have what I've been reading accessible to me. The other thing is I keep a book of books. So I always write down what I've read, and the book of books is precious to me. It's my diary. It tells you where my mind was.
How long have you had the book of books?
10 years. I wish I'd had it longer, but I've had it for about 10 years.
Is it backed up anywhere? Like, do you have copies?
Oh, it's actually I should. It's an actual book. For some reason, I really feel strongly about, but I could at least copy the pages.
Hey, take some pictures of. I had a friend who, I don't know how this happens in like 2020, but who lost the dissertation. And I'm like, you never emailed it to yourself or backed it up in the cloud, or so I've been like hyper vigilant of just like emailing myself everything, taking pictures of like, so this is my interruption to say like,
all right, I will go and copy the book of books.
Because if you lost that book, I would be devastated.
Oh yeah, no, it would be awful.
I can't imagine.
It would be awful. Yeah.
I can't imagine. And do you used to commute? Oh, I don't know if maybe you can say, but like for a long time you live in Princeton.
I do.
But you've worked in Washington, D.C., and so you've commuted via train for many years. I imagine you did a lot of reading on the train, and how's the pandemic? How have you been navigating the pandemic? How has it shifted your relationship to work, reading, and are you able to sort of, when everything is, we're in our homes all the time, or some to varying degrees now, but were for a year and a half. Were you able to? How much of this book was written during the pandemic itself, and then how effectively were you able to sort of work and think and synthesize your thoughts in this context of what the last year and a half have been?
So almost all of the book was written in the pandemic. I had written 2 chapters as of February 2020. Of course, I was supposed to have been much further along, and it was supposed to be due in April 2020. And of course,
welcome to the club that is all
exactly. I mean, it's still college basically. The deadline helps, but so I really wrote it between March and August of 2020, and then sent out the first version in August of 2020 to a handful of people, very diverse, eclectic range of people. Got back some pretty tough stuff, including from the reviewers. Did a complete rewrite in November. And to your point, what I would do is take vacation. I'd take paid time off from New America to get, that week where you just have to be completely immersed. Like that's all you're going to do. And then once you're there, you can write on top of other things. And then did another rewrite, not an extensive one, but still some major revisions in February. So it was almost all during the pandemic. I definitely think not traveling helped hugely, because even though you might read or work on a plane or a train, the amount of just, time spent getting places.
Right.
So I think it made it better. I think actually also being stationary was helpful for just the kind of deep reflective work that I needed to do, and being at home. I'll say though, after I finished the book, two things happened in the pandemic. One, I'd never read mysteries before, but there came a point where I was so bored. I just, even as a voracious reader, I just discovered all these mystery writers. I never read any mysteries. Anthony Horowitz, who writes these wonderful things. And then, so I've read a lot of mysteries. And as I said, they're sort of like candy. And then for a while, I became obsessed with the New York Times spelling bee. And it actually really cut into my reading time, to the point that my husband flat out told me I was becoming boring, because instead of telling him, reading him snippets from whatever I was reading when we're both in bed, I would be sitting there desperately trying to make words out of 7 letters. So I had to go cold turkey this summer. I just said, I'm done. I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm back to reading.
That's so funny. It is an addicting thing.
It is an addicting if you love words,
it is. You got to be wary. The thing, throughout this book, part of what you do is like a deep, and Lissa alluded to this in the beginning, but like you really look in the mirror and do some deep personal excavation, interrogation, examination. Was that always the vision you had of what this book would be? I mean, because it is, even though the book is about different things throughout, and it's touching on and tackling different themes, different topics, different issues, the undercurrent of it all is like a deep examination of what you once believed and what you believe now, what you said versus what you meant, what you, just really going back through the sort of mostly recent history. And just sort of like for the reader, saying this is where I was wrong and where I messed up and where I wish I had done something different, which is a really vulnerable thing to put in a book and to show people and and strangers and folks you don't know and folks you do know. Was that always the idea? And how, what was that like, trying to put that on the page and to put it in conversation with a lot of the big sort of societal topics that you were attempting to tackle?
So it was always going to be part of the book. The first chapter I had actually drafted as an article called "When Leadership Means Having to Say You're Sorry," because it was that part I'd learned a lot. And I do think the experience of writing "Why Women Still Can't Have It All" in the Atlantic in 2012, which I never expected to have that much impact, but did, and really changed my life, I realized that I had an ability to talk about myself in a way that gave a lot of people access to then bigger questions. So it's, I'm not going to write a memoir. I'm not Barack Obama, right? That's not interesting, but I did. So I had always conceived of this first chapter about what I'd learned, but also I'd seen this looking in the mirror, and this is what the nation also has to do. As I got into the book and as it started to really take shape, I realized I needed that narrative as the spine, right? I mean, you've got to have something, as you say, it's very eclectic in places. So you've got to have something to hold on to. And that thing is my journey. And then, but the other thing is, even as I write about George Floyd's murder and Tyra Mariani, who was my president, who's now running Howard Schultz's foundation. And we're writing this statement that all organizations are writing in condemning systemic racism. And she basically looks at me and says, you know, this is all very well, but the people of color at New America are going to be asking, you know, what about the racism in here, not just the racism out there? And she's not singling out New America. She's talking about every organization in DC. And that triggers a whole nother round of leading differently. And so even as I'm writing, I'm also learning, as I will continue to do. The other reason I do it, though, and there are parts that were hard to write, and my mother's still cringing, and there were, you know, people who said, just don't do this, don't do this, particularly as a woman, right? You're really laying yourself open. I wanted to model just how hard I really think the work this country has to do is. And it's work I've had to do both personally, but also in terms of, as I said, revising what I grew up with, revising my own understanding of my country. And I wanted to show that you really can do it. It's hard, but you can do it, and you will be stronger and more confident and better able to change as a result. So I'm really kind of modeling the very thing that I'm trying to encourage people to do at various levels. And I hope the balance is right. I mean, that, you know, readers will decide. I spent a lot of time on that part. It was hard. I cut out a lot of stuff. And you know, again, you also don't want to wallow in your own story. And I'm very aware, as I make clear, like in comparison to what a lot of people have been through, this is not, you know, this is not an earth-shaking life crisis. It may have been for me, but
no, I think, as I mentioned to you, I think that what stands out about the book is its level of thoughtfulness and self-reflection in ways that I think a lot of books about leadership are written that aren't self-reflective at all, and that are largely sort of, you know, to use the sort of educator Paulo Freire's conception of like you're pouring things into a jar without like doing any sort of examination of like what that's not, you know, his framework is that, you know, so many teachers like pour things into jars, and like that is what education is to them,
right?
Whereas education is something that's actually much more communal. And part of what you talk about is all of the things that you learned from Tyra, all of the things that you learned from your colleagues and staff at New America, from the things that you read, and recognizing that leadership is not, you know, just like bestowing ideas and like making making sort of unilateral singular decisions. It is about creating community, even when that community is hard. You talk about when you sort of expanded the leadership table at New America, and that it is like you purposefully gave up some of your power, right? And decision making and sort of singular decision making ability, because you were in the process of attempting to live out this idea that this is not the sort of leadership that I want to model or be a part of, because I'm trying to embody and model what I think a better society would look like.
Exactly. But it was scary. I tell the story of the first day Tyra ran the meeting, and I'm sitting there thinking, what have I done? You know, I've just written myself out of this picture. But it didn't turn out that way. So
I'm going to start bringing in some questions from the audience. And Kathleen's asking, how can we come to agree? How can we come to agree on truths? And how can we recognize that truth in history evolves through the processes of research and evaluation by historians?
Yeah. Well, so I'm not sure. That really does depend on the we. And right now, obviously, there's just enormous contestation over what the United States has been and what it is today. And that is inevitable, because we are in the midst of this enormous demographic change, and we are moving from a white majority to a plurality nation. So different voices are being heard. They have to be heard, and different strands of our history that was submerged under one narrative. I think, and I don't know that there's any way that's going to get everybody to accept a dramatically revised narrative. I do think Jill Lepore's book, These Truths, is a wonderful effort to try to weave together all these different strands in one volume. But for me, the answer comes, I talk a lot about the muscles of both and. And in fact, Alyssa will remember Hillary Clinton always talked about both and. It's not either or, it is both and. There's, this is a country, a history, a narrative capacious enough to hold us all. And again, this is exactly in many ways what Heather McGhee is writing about in The Sum of Us, where we're trapped in a binary. It's either white or black, it's either rich or poor. No, so the answer to your question, I think, is that we can try to tell our history in the sense of ever expanding circles or a tapestry to which you're adding more and more depth and complexity. I talk about reading the histories of going across the Great Plains in a wagon train, which is always this narrative of rugged individualism and the hardy pioneers. Well, you read the histories of the women, and it's all about solidarity and interdependence. But that doesn't deny the experience of many of their husbands or the men in their lives. It adds to it. So that's where I think we have to start, which is this constant, hey, let's make this richer. Let's bring more in rather than let's supplant your narrative with mine.
Something that's been asked in the chat and part of what you talk about in the book, kind of indirectly, in some ways directly, in some ways indirectly, are the ways that the different social movements of the past several years have played a role in shaping and recalibrating the way you think about a host of issues. And so, for example, you talk about, and you mentioned how George Floyd and Black Lives Matter over the past several years has helped you re-examine the way that you think about race in your own past and things like that. And I'm wondering, and some folks are wondering also, how, given that you sort of came to a different level of prominence after the Atlantic article, and that you were, and that the part of the conversation that was happening was around like what feminism is and isn't, and what is modern day feminism, and what is the modern woman, how does she make decisions? How has, if at all, Me Too over the last few years shaped or challenged or animated the way that you think of your own feminism and feminism more broadly?
Well, one thing I do say in the book, there's an appeal toward the end that I say, look, this book is for everyone. But I also talk about how many movements, including Me Too and Black Lives Matter, have been founded by women. And really women as moral activists. And so you can go back to the Christian Women's Temperance Union, which is probably not one. I'm glad that ultimately prohibition was reversed, but obviously the suffragettes, but there are others. And these are not, many of these are white women. They're certainly more affluent women because they're women who have time. But so part of what I've been impressed by is exactly what I think of as the power of many women to make change and to think about it, and particularly older women. I mean, those of us whose children are now out of the nest. Me Too has been, I'm deeply supportive in so many ways, and interestingly, it has, I now talk about career feminism and care feminism. The career feminism is traditional, again, the feminism mostly of white affluent women, but that we want to have careers like men. Care feminism is much more about elevating the value of the work women have traditionally done. Me Too reminded us, for me, because I was in law school in the 80s and Kitty McKinnon was writing in the 70s, and Andrea Dworkin, right? Sexual harassment wasn't even on the books as something illegal. And so it really reminded me that no matter how far you think we've come, here is this basic thing that was really at the heart particularly the more radical feminists in the 1970s to say, no, you don't get to grope me. Because before that, unless it was rape, it was basically just fine. So it made me sad to realize how much of it is still there, but it made me proud to see that people could break it open. And also Jodi Kantor, and I'm blanking on her colleague's name, but her wonderful colleague at the New York Times.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Really helped break it open. So did Ronan Farrow. But I will say, I'm the mother of two sons who are both in college. And I support Me Too wholeheartedly. It also needs complexity in various places. And we're starting to navigate with that. And it's so hard because the last thing in the world you want to do is silence the women who have been silenced for so long. And yet there are cases, and we've seen them. And certainly, I think overall, it's probably a good thing that boys are, really asking, is this consent? And of course, there's all the liquor around it. But there are also cases of kids whose lives have been ruined and didn't, ruined for now anyway. And then you get back into that complexity of moral judgments and, well, but look, here's the mass here and the individual case there. So it has been a process of taking pride, but also one of really living the complexity, again, as the mother of sons who are college age and really challenged by the changing rules, which they support, but they're also lost at times.
Catherine is asking, how important is the cultivation of empathy as a general capacity to national renewal?
Very important. And one of the things that the process of Black Lives Matter, but more importantly, what New America calls its equity transformation, so many of us have nobody of color in our intimate life. And I don't mean our family intimate life. I mean, what my president, Paul Butler, says. He does an exercise where name the 10 people who are most important in your life outside your family, the people you're going to absolutely call. It's amazing how many of us, that circle is all one group, our group. And so empathy is critically important, but you can't have empathy unless you have contact. And this is, again, we know this, diversity, equity, and inclusion, just hiring people is not going to get you there. And inclusion is not necessarily, it helps, but we need to really engage with people as friends, right? As Tyra and I bonded over clothes, over over leadership challenges. It wasn't just a working relationship. It was a working relationship that became a friendship. And I'm so aware of, in my own circles, of how unusual that is. And we're never going to get to the country that we need to get to unless we can find ways of really crossing those more intimate barriers of friendship and, of course, love.
I think we are close to being at time. And just to wrap us up, we talked about this a little bit before, but I would love, you've been talking about mysteries have been your big thing right now. If there were a handful of books that you wish like every person in this country would read, let's say 3 books. Not to put too much pressure, 3 books that, or three books, it doesn't have to be the 3 books, but just 3 books that have been really, and you cite so many of them in the book, but I would love to leave the audience with 3 books that have been particularly insightful or fascinating or mind expanding, that have stayed with you and that you wish others would read.
This is where your mind goes blank, but one definitely is Toni Morrison's collection of essays, which was published originally under the title Mouthful of Blood, which is drawn from her commemoration of the 9/11 when she dedicated Princeton's Memorial Garden. It's just, Her writing is so extraordinary. But these essays, these are speeches and essays, and it was republished under a different name, so it's not Mouthful of Blood. But I read it really carefully, and taking time and covering it, and it just cracked my heart open in so many ways. It's so intelligently deep and complex, and yet written, like a great novelist can write. So that one is definitely one. I would read Kisa Lehman's Heavy, which was another book that was a total surprise and is a really brave book. I mean, it's really brave. And one of the things I say is, here's an African-American man who has a lot to lose. Right. In the end, I can lose things, but in the grand scheme of things, I don't have much to lose. He has a lot to lose. And it really got me, that book. Just and then and the other one I would read, there are many, but these are just three that come to mind. Girl, Woman, Other. And which was won the Man Booker Prize or the Pulitzer, the Man Booker Prize, I think. And there's this great line. It's all about the generational tension, right? It's Amma and her daughter Yaz, and there's this great line where Amma's, she's a feminist, she's a woman of color, she's British, and her daughter says, "Oh, Mom, feminism is so herd-like," and she basically says something like, "Well, being a woman is so passé these days." And I just thought it's just, and it's also a novel written in a different form. So it's one of the novels that made me think maybe I can do something different in a nonfiction format. So there are hundreds of others, but those are three.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those with us. What all of you should do immediately is go purchase all three of those titles from Politics and Prose.
Exactly.
And you should purchase Renewal immediately. Sometimes, we've had a lot of virtual book events. Sometimes we do this thing where we click on the link, the tab sits there for a long time, and you're like, I'll get to it. Don't do that. Don't be like me. You have to do it right now while you still hear our voices. Go buy this book. It's so thoughtful, so important for a moment like this to have leaders who are doing this really important work of excavating what their leadership has looked like and what they want it to look like and what they want our society to look like. So Anne-Marie, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Lissa, thank you for having such a wonderful bookstore. And it's been a pleasure to spend the evening with you all.
Well, we are lucky to have both of you. Oh my gosh. And Anne-Marie, as Clint said, please buy this book. As Anne-Marie said, it's not that long. It's slim and it's great. So, you got everything you need for a gift or for yourself. And also buy Clint's book, which is, as I said, it's a masterpiece, and you can find that on our website. We just think it's one of the great books of this year. Both of these are such huge contributions to the discourse we need to be having right now, and to have you both together tonight on PNP Live is such an incredible honor for us, really. And what a great conversation. I knew it would be. Obviously, we could listen to you for hours. Clint, I'm tempted to ask you your three books, but we're out of time. So next time we're going to get you to tell us your favorite three books. And Anne-Marie, I'm sending you a list of mysteries that I've been reading because, like you, I just got into mysteries too. So must be the pandemic or something.
Absolutely.
And all of you in the audience, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate that you were here to listen to this conversation. We appreciate your support. We would not be in business without you all. So thank you. We wish you all a